I'm Josh Hammer.
I'm Emily Jashinsky.
I'm Ben Weingarten.
And I'm Rachel Bovard.
And this is NatCon Squad, where common good and common sense meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. So we've got another action-packed, substantively, thematically wide-ranging show for you today. Rachel will kick us off with Antitrust coming for big tech. I can barely even hide my grin as I read that headline. I will do a segment on Biden's return to multilateralism. Ben is going to host a segment on the so-called domestic terror strategy. And Emily will conclude with a look at Jeff Bezos's company, Amazon's draconian labor laws. So look, we're going to start with tech. We'll end it with tech. So Emily, Rachel, for that matter, actually, why don't you start us off with antitrust?
So it's a big week for antitrust enforcement, which, I think for 50 years, the right really hasn't cared about, but now we are being all forced to care about because it's in the news every day. But some key areas of note being that the House Antitrust Subcommittee just released late last week a series of 5 bills designed exclusively to target anti-competitive entrenchment by the big 5 or by the big tech platforms. And this is a wager by the subcommittee, which I think is very interesting, which is to say, the hotly partisan aspects of the social media debate, the big tech platform debate, which is all around sort of ideology and speech control and sort of that partisan area, that's actually downstream of market power. And, we think, says the subcommittee, that we can actually get those concerns addressed if we first make a concerted effort to break that concentrated economic power, that we can compete some of those speech concerns away. And so I really think it's an interesting approach for them to take, given the climate that, a lot of these debates take place in. The second thing that I think is really interesting to note is that this week, Senator Mike Lee from Utah introduced his own antitrust reform bill. And now, if you are familiar at all with Senator Mike Lee, he's sort of a leading figure in the more like libertarian leaning conservative movement, the conservative legal movement at large, which is, I think, sort of loath to embrace any sort of antitrust enforcement generally, and definitely not, anything that says the status quo is not working. This is a really big deal from Senator Lee. And now this represents, I think, almost a consensus position from everybody from Senator Josh Hawley to Democrat Amy Klobuchar to libertarian firebrand Mike Lee, all agreeing that the status quo in the tech marketplace is not working as it relates to antitrust enforcement. Now, they all have different approaches. In the Republican conference itself, you have Senator Hawley, who would completely upend sort of the consumer welfare standard conservative approach to antitrust enforcement, which has guided the jurisprudence of antitrust for the last, 30, 40 years. He would upend that and replace it with a competition standard. And then on the other side of that spectrum is Mike Lee, who is saying, we do need reforms here. And one of those is to actually codify the consumer welfare standard in its full remit. Because one of the critiques that I've made of this, and Senator Lee has as well, is that the consumer welfare standard, as it was pioneered by Judge Robert Bork, Richard Posner, and others, has been sort of constrained to this sort of exclusive focus on price, right? And so every, merger and acquisition is looked at through this very narrow lens of, are prices going up or down? And if they're going down, then it's good, full stop. But if you actually go back and assess, Bork's original sort of big thesis on this and the antitrust paradox, he talks about this idea that the consumer welfare standard was actually quite robust, and it should encompass things like innovation and consumer choice and quality and all these offerings that aren't really currently reflected in how antitrust enforcement is done. So that's a shift for the right. And I really, can't emphasize enough that this has been a dramatic shift on the right. That's really only occurred in the last year or so, for an area of relative obscurity in the legal world, tied to this very specific frame of ideology has ruptured. And what you're seeing now, especially, I would add to this, the recent confirmation yesterday of Lina Khan to the FTC, and immediately upon her confirmation, her elevation as chair. Now, she is a progressive antitrust enforcer. She would upend all the ways in which antitrust, is currently interpreted. She won't be able to do that unless Congress changes the law, but she will be an aggressive enforcer. She got 72 votes on cloture and 69 votes to confirm her. Okay, I just want to say that again. A very progressive antitrust enforcer. If a filibuster was still in place, all the filibusters are gone now for nominations, but if there was one mounted against her, she would have successfully overcome it. In a hotly contested, partisan 50-50 Senate, Lena Khan got 69 votes. So I do think this is very reflective of the new era that we're in, with the tech platforms, but also I think with concentrated economic power at large, with the right waking up to how it can be weaponized against them. So that's a very long summation of recent events. So I'll kind of toss it open. Maybe Josh to start first, because I think you probably have even a more robust perspective on this from the legal side of things.
Well, maybe. Rachel, Rachel, you had a fantastic recent essay at the American Conservative calling for Republicans to rethink antitrust. Our friend Mike Davis had a very lengthy initial Substack post calling for much the same. It's just so encouraging to see this kind of revolution, this re-engaging of kind of bromides that have become stale over decades. To speak of Mike Davis, that is, had a very funny tweet. He basically said, Mike Lee coming around to rethink antitrust is basically like Chuck Grassley coming around to rethink ethanol subsidies. And, the inside joke there's that Mike Davis was Chuck Grassley's chief counsel for years. I feel like I've said this on this podcast before, but I actually worked in antitrust research between college and law school. In my first year of law school summer, I worked for Senator Mike Lee as a Senate Judiciary Committee law clerk on his staff, largely due to the fact that then as now he's very active on antitrust issues. And I remember kind of when I started there, kind of the sense in the room, this is kind of 2014, kind of like late stage Tea Party era, not quite the rise of MAGA yet. The sense in the room at the time was that there was really no such thing as a merger that Mike Lee would not just kind of be hands-off approach to on kind of, standard kind of deregulatory laissez-faire grounds. So for him coming out here, and the crux of his particular bill, as Rachel says, is not necessarily just codifying kind of this Burkean consumer welfare standard, but actually codifying a robust multi-variable, multi-criteria definition of what the consumer welfare standard actually is. Because just to kind of get in the weeds a little bit more here, the issue with how the consumer welfare standard has been subsequently interpreted, not just by Burke, but by various kind of Burke acolytes over the decades, is that there has been this kind of monolithic obsession with price. But, as any kind of consumer of Facebook, Google knows, the quote unquote price of these products is generally $0.00. So the way that this has been interpreted just simply does not apply for the current paradigm. Whether it's that, whether it's kind of a, the term that gets tossed around is Brandeisian, whether it's kind of a Brandeisian kind of big is bad approach that we associate with folks like Matt Stoller, Josh Hawley is certainly kind of very close to that. The upshot here is that there is an emerging consensus, I think, that the status quo is not working. A point that Rachel makes, that Mike makes, a lot of kind of antitrust reformers on the right make, is that to the extent we care about this, the history of antitrust is a Republican Party policy. John Sherman, the brother of William Tecumseh Sherman, the Civil War era general. He was an Ohio congressman and senator. He gave his name to the Sherman Antitrust Act. Teddy Roosevelt, of course, was a Republican president. Josh Hawley wrote a biography on him. So we kind of see all these circles kind of colliding here. Anyway, as someone who kind of comes back to this kind of somewhat kind of caveman style, reward our friends, punish our enemies kind of notion of politics, I am very encouraged to see Republicans kind of being awokened, if you will, to the real threat of big tech in a way that is not merely rhetorical, it's not merely kind of finger wagging at Mark Zuckerberg or Jack Dorsey, but actually legitimately punishing them for their bad deeds and their bad behavior.
I just have a really quick addition to all of this, which is I think these companies made an incredible error in angering both the left and the right, needlessly so. It's needless from their perspective, but they really, really, really found a way to rankle people on the left and the right, in that it now, for the sake of political expediency, it now makes sense to cast votes like this because their constituents are so incensed by what's happening in Silicon Valley. So there may not be bipartisan consensus on the avenues for reform, but there is increasing bipartisan consensus on the sort of just empty vessels, or empty vessels isn't even true, because they're not merely empty. They're, in some cases they're actually evil, and entirely backwards. So I just think there's this emergent consensus is what is making it possible for Washington to jump on Silicon Valley. And it didn't have to be this way. They could have just behaved themselves a lot better. But no, they wanted the power. They wanted to be oligarchs, and now they're going to get it.
I'll just make two really brief points. The first is in terms of the sort of welfare standard and it all coming down to price, or at least being interpreted that way. I think I've said a variation of this in the past. There was a price, a substantial incremental price that was paid for pursuing on the basis of ideology, a position that proved untenable in practical form. And that is, besides, of course, all of our information and our privacy, we lost a free and open public square in a venue that was supposed to exist in the digital sphere. And as we've discussed before, per the preamble or the prefatory portions of Section 230, the letter and spirit of that statute was about ensuring a free and open public square of ideas. So we've paid a substantial cost that cannot be measured in terms of dollars and cents as a consequence of the status quo policies. And the only other point that I'll make is the devil is going to be in the details and execution here. I do think that it is a good thing that on this issue, at least, of concentrated power, there does seem to be widespread understanding among our political class that the American people writ large, who they so poorly represent in so many other areas, are fed up and have had enough of it, and that concentrated power is viewed, of all kinds, is viewed as a threat by the American people, except, of course, the government's own concentrated power, which they'll never relinquish. But we have to be careful in terms of the execution and implementation of this from the perspective, the cynical perspective, looked at through the lens of sort of Josh's caveman view, so to speak, of if the left gets its hands on concentrated corporate power, how will it try to manipulate that corporate power towards its own ends? Whereas our ends are essentially, let's have real, free, and open competition. I fear that the left, in terms of breaking concentrated corporate power, will try to convert that power towards its own ends. And so we have to be very vigilant on that count.
Yeah, no doubt about that. I mean, antitrust definitely should be used as a scalpel and not as a sledgehammer. And I hope the emerging consensus reflects that. So let's transition. There's really no way to make this kind of a smooth transition, but let's kind of move from the domestic realm into the foreign realm just for a little bit here. So we're recording this on Wednesday. If I'm not mistaken, Joe Biden met earlier today with Vladimir Putin in Geneva, Switzerland, I believe. He had just kind of jetted off to Switzerland from Brussels, where he was meeting with NATO. He came to Brussels from Cornwall in England, where he was there for the G7 summit. And his rhetoric on this tour, maybe perhaps I haven't really had that chance to catch up yet on what happened with Putin, but at least in the G7 and at NATO, a lot of the rhetoric and the substance kind of focused on this return to the kind of pre-Trump status quo ante of multilateralism, transnationalism, globalism, whatever you want to call it. All these things are referring to the same concept, of course, which is, a kind of a willful kind of outsourcing of sovereignty to unaccountable institutions, the United Nations, of course, the WHO, WTO. We're all familiar with this kind of alphabet soup consortium of agencies that love to regulate, that love to kind of undermine our sovereignty. And when Joe Biden was in Cornwall in England meeting with the G7, he really did not even make any attempt whatsoever to hide his just visceral contempt for his kind of, the perceived unilateralism of the previous administration, which is somewhat of a misnomer. Maybe we could talk about that a little bit. But I'm just going to briefly quote Joe Biden. This is in Cornwall, England, at the G7 summit earlier this week. Quote, "The only way we're going to meet the global threats that we're is by working together and with our partners and our allies. And I conveyed to each of my G7 counterparts that the United States is going to do our part. America is back at the table. America is back at the table." Here's the key part. "The lack of participation in the past and full engagement was noticed significantly, not only by the leaders of those countries, but by the people in the G7 countries. And America is back in the business of leading the world alongside nations who share our most deeply held values." So there you go. The cat is being let out of the bag there. This is all about kind of the neoliberal, the so-called rules-based international order. Very hard to kind of it's very hard to divorce this sentiment from the notion that America is the world's policeman, which of course we are not. We are a sovereign nation with our own national self-interest here. And I think obviously this stands in pretty stark contrast to the way that President Trump conducted his foreign policy. Mike Anton of Hillsdale College and Claremont Institute had a really long and I thought quite good essay for Foreign Policy magazine, kind of laying out the Trump doctrine. The Trump doctrine, of course, was very heavily nation state centered. It was national interest centered. It kind of eschewed outsourcing sovereignty to these various institutions. It would never speak of kind of allying with nations that share our, quote, deeply held values. This is kind of a very neoliberal, neoconservative thing to say. It's a common trope amongst what some people call the foreign policy blob, the bipartisan blob that kind of imbues itself in all the various neoliberal think tanks in Washington, D.C. And I think, another way of looking at this, which again is kind of the Trump doctrine that Michael Anton spoke about, is also reflected in what I thought was a really good Wall Street Journal op-ed from over 2 years ago. The title of the op-ed is "Why America Needs New Alliances." It was co-written by Edmund Burke Foundation's own Yoram Hazon, Ophir Ha'ivri. And, they say here, quote, "Rather than carelessly accumulate dependencies, the U.S. must ask where it can develop real allies, countries that share its commitment to a world of independent nations, pursue democratic self-determination, although not necessarily liberalism, at home, and are willing to pay the price for freedom by taking primary responsibility for their own defense and shouldering the human and economic costs involved." So that's a very, very, very different way, of course, of viewing foreign policy. I think it's a much healthier way here. But, look, like with so many things, we're just kind of seeing a return to the Obama era here. In many ways, the Biden administration, of course, is just a third Obama term. We knew that would be the case. So some people would kind of air their grievances to the contrary and say, oh, it's Joe Biden. He's a centrist. He's a moderate. No, he's not. OK, he's Barack Obama's vice president, and this is who he is. So I guess I am a little worried that a lot of kind of the Trump era foreign policy successes, and of which there actually were many, in the Middle East, there was the Abraham Accords. In Asia, of course, Trump was the first president since Nixon went to China to actually meaningfully confront in any way whatsoever the rise of the Chinese Communist Party. But really, from my perspective, we talked about this a little bit when I did my segment on Central and Eastern Europe. The future of American foreign policy, it has to get away from these largely awful Western European countries. Okay, the future of American foreign policy simply cannot be Germany, France, Belgium, Denmark, these godforsaken social democracies. And I just really hope that even while we're kind of, in proverbial political exile during the Biden administration, that we don't forget about the various successes of the Trump administration, bolstering allies like the UAE and Saudi in the Middle East, bolstering Japan, India, in Asia, Brazil, and in Latin America, countries that actually care about their national interests and care about combating totalitarianism and globalism, whether it is in the most extreme visceral form of like Nazism or communism, or in a slightly less visceral but still totalitarian and dangerous form like the European Union or NATO. So I'll stop ranting, kind of throw it over to the panel at that point. Ben, you've written about these issues prolifically, so curious if you have any thoughts to what you've seen from Biden in Europe so far.
Yeah, it's tough to stomach, admittedly, and there are so many different directions we can go with this. And I spoke with President Trump last week in New York City, and he was talking about some of the things that it's going to be very tough for the Biden administration to overturn, which he was proud of, including the embassy in Jerusalem, the tariffs, which the Biden administration notably has not taken off China. And he spoke about several other pacts and moves internationally as well, pulling out of Afghanistan, which he says it would basically have been impossible for Biden to stop that train. So he touted those results, but at the same time lamented the various collapses and caves around the world. And one of the things that President Trump emphasized was, look, he took a very tough line on any number of nations, and consequently those nations moved and got in line, whether it was making South Korea pay for the security umbrella that we provide. And we could debate the wisdom of that, but he was tough on them and he ended up extracting a greater payments as a consequence of it. Or the Northern Triangle countries. He said he essentially cast the Biden administration as foolish and idiotic for offering billions of dollars to the Northern Triangle countries. And then one of those countries, at least, came and basically smacked the Biden administration in the face for saying that it was the Biden administration's open border policies that are creating this massive influx of immigrants towards the U.S. And it's the Biden administration's fault. And we can run down the list. We know obviously that there's a massive push to again try to make Iran world's leading state sponsor of jihad, the strong horse in the Middle East. Or we can talk about Nord Stream 2. The Biden administration takes off the sanctions, provides sanctions waivers with respect to Nord Stream 2, supposedly to curry favor with Germany, which gives Russia great leverage. And, where are the cause of collusion and treason with the Biden administration? Obviously, softness with respect to China and continuing to defer to the WHO with respect to the lab leak probe, and on and on and on, issue after issue. It's a disaster. But the primary thing is that when the administration says America is back, and all of these European partners and allies, you look at these polls that the left loves to cite, the confidence in America is back, and there's a favorable view of the administration. That's not a good thing, because what that means is that we are back to globalist progressivism and putting America's national interest last, not first. Essentially, the administration talks about affirmatively advancing equity domestically. There's an international analog to that as well, which is essentially affirmative action for all the world's worst adversaries. And again, self-abnegation, putting America last in every single respect, our blood, our treasure, our sovereignty, our rights and liberties, and subjecting them essentially to an international veto, and really putting the interest in effect of our adversaries first. And I said this on radio in this last week, that the G7 was essentially a pep rally for communist China. It wasn't cast that way, but in effect, that's the consequence of it. So there are myriad disasters associated with it. And the lesson of the Trump administration, one of the many lessons of the Trump administration, is you can definitely work with allies and partners, but they really have to share America's values and interests. And unfortunately, what we see now are values and interests that are completely alien and anathema to at least half the country on full display. And last but not least, it's just worth saying that President Biden went overseas and attacked the Trump base of the Republican Party as sort of a rump and a minority. There used to be a rule about that domestic politics ended at the water's edge. And so for all of the talk about norms and what's been done in the past, the Biden administration threw that out the window and essentially attacked half the country overseas, which is shameful.
Quickly, I'll just say it's amazing what happened when this sort of Donald Trump foreign policy that was said, this could never, we'd never have a leader who conducted himself and conducted America's business this way. It would be a disaster across the board. The world would come crumbling down. And when Donald Trump sort of injected that into the foreign policy bloodstream, it's actually not what happened. A lot of things sort of turned out a whole lot better than what the sort of experts in the neoconservative world predicted it would. Neoconservative and neoliberal political establishment, the sort of egg-headed people on the Sunday shows who are constantly decrying and warning of anything that might upset the order that they have so carefully constructed. They said it would be a disaster. And I think actually what Donald Trump proved is that for all of his many flaws, there's something to be said for that brash American style of, threatening NATO and like actually making serious things that you follow through on. And so I think it's a stark contrast with Joe Biden's sort of return to normal.
And extracting massive contributions from NATO as well, just worth pointing out.
Right. Yeah, I don't have anything much more to add, only that I really do think that like this return to liberal internationalism is a jobs program for the blob. And that blob exists in, New York City and Washington, D.C. And it's a bunch of people whose theories are never proven. And yet we as a country are hamstrung to them constantly. Donald Trump, I think, really did prove that we are and perhaps have always been just in the era of great power politics, where you assert your interests where necessary, you align yourself with people who share specific interests at specific times, what that represents, unilateral, bilateral trade agreements. COVID itself proved that countries will always act in their best interests when the economic situation pushes them in that direction. And so why our foreign policy doesn't reflect this consistently is beyond me. The only thing I can come down to is that, again, the ruling elite in the blob want to keep it so because, how else are they going to make a living? That's it.
No, totally. The jobs program for the blob is a good soundbite. If you come away from this podcast with only that soundbite, then you've done a good job listening and paying attention. But Ben, why don't you tell us about what's going on the domestic front, taking it back to the homeland?
Yeah, I've been warning for weeks, screaming from some rooftop that this effort by the Biden administration to develop the contours of and ultimately execute a war on domestic terrorism threatened our most basic natural rights, frankly, not just our civil rights, but our natural rights that we're born with. And that was proven, I believe, in the text that came out this week with the administration releasing its domestic strategy to counter domestic terrorism. And I'd summarize it as this: anti-racism is the countering domestic terror strategy, and the countering domestic terror strategy is infrastructure. And I'll explain that thread in just a minute. But it's worth noting, I warned about this being a war on wrongthink in practice. And it's worth noting from some of the text, the threats that the administration perceives. So here's a direct quote: newer socio-political developments, such as narratives of fraud in the recent general election, the emboldening impact of the violent breach of the US Capitol, conditions related to the COVID-19 pandemic, and conspiracy theories promoting violence will almost certainly spur some DVEs, domestic violent extremists, to try to engage in violence this year. So you know exactly where this is going. And you recall that it's the same administrative state in power and many of the former Obama-Biden administration officials who are pulling the levers at the top of our national security and law enforcement and intelligence apparatus. So it's worth reading a couple quick sections of this strategy because it reveals just how imperiled potentially our rights are as Americans, and it should chill everyone across the board here. So the strategy notes in its text, past U.S. government prevention efforts have had a mixed record. We need to do better at protecting rights and freedoms while still pursuing the goal of preventing individuals from harming their fellow Americans through terrorism or other criminal activity. There is not one shred, not one iota of evidence reading that to suggest that anything in this administration will be different from the ones that preceded it, in particular, again, because the entire administrative state is still all there. In fact, some of the worst actors have probably been promoted. So it's a joke that they recognize this in the text of the document, and it's so Orwellian that they even raise it as they do. The document also notes appropriate elements of the intel and law enforcement communities have already identified and are now implementing more robust information exchanges with foreign partners regarding the foreign connections to the U.S. domestic terrorism threat. So what does that mean? Well, in practice, should we not suspect that this means that the U.S. government will potentially use other governments' intelligence services to surveil American citizens? Certainly seems that way. And if past is prologue, that certainly seems to be one of the threats associated with this. But wait, there's still more. The Department of Homeland Security and others are either currently funding and implementing or planning evidence-based digital programming, including enhancing media literacy and critical thinking skills. You should trust the government to do that, as a mechanism for strengthening user resilience to disinformation and misinformation online for domestic audiences. I mean, what could possibly go wrong putting the government in that driver's seat? Purveyors of disinformation and misinformation themselves, and the ones who put the thumb on the scale with social media companies and tell them to prevent what turn out to be legitimate criticisms and narratives on social media. But now I get to the anti-racism part of this and the infrastructure part, which really gives away the whole game about what the administration is trying to do here. And that's impose its ideology on America and threaten and chill those who won't go along with it. Editorializing a bit here. It notes, tackling the threat posed by domestic terrorism over the long term demands substantial efforts to confront the racism that feeds into aspects of that threat. We are therefore prioritizing efforts to ensure every component of the government has a role to play in rooting out racism and advancing equity. So what does that mean? Again, anti-racism is the countering domestic terror strategy. It's imposing the left's ideology on America under the guise of national security. And it even goes beyond that, because the bill also talks about a variety of other policies that need to be imposed on the country, touching on everything from economics to culture and beyond, to ensure that essentially the root cause conditions that might lead to domestic violent extremism are dealt with. So all in all, this is using national security as a cudgel, as a weapon to browbeat tens of millions of Americans potentially and cast them as potential or actual domestic violent extremists and use it as a justification to impose the whole left's agenda. That's how I see it. And I turn it over to the panel for your impressions of some of the text that I've read.
So I think that, one of the really troubling aspects of all of this is, I think that you touched on the extent to which they're willing to go to circumvent what would otherwise be pretty strong constitutional protections against their ability to surveil and detain citizens on this front. We're seeing this already. There was an article maybe a month ago at this point, CNN actually reported that DOD, wants to infiltrate social media accounts and, internet chat rooms, if they're, I guess, still chat rooms still exist, but they would be constrained by the Constitution. That, they're not allowed to go in and misrepresent who they are and then use that as a means of enforcement, but that they can outsource that. They can give it to private companies who are not similarly constrained by the Bill of Rights to be able to do that for them. Similarly, we've already seen, DOD, which took a hit, a couple of years ago when the Congress passed USA Freedom, which curtailed, the practices of bulk metadata collection on American citizens. You are already seeing DOD now transact in the secondary data market to purchase data on consumers and citizens, and that's a completely legal thing for them to do, but it aids and abets, again, the thing that you point out, which is this very ideological agenda classifying certain ways of thinking or implication as domestic terrorism. So I've spoken about this before, but this sort of unification of our military or our spy enterprises with private industry, not at all constrained by any sort of constitutional element, but also not constrained at all. We do not have a federal privacy law in this country. We do not have any biometric privacy requirements at the federal level. We have a patchwork of state laws, but that is it. That fusion, I think, should trouble all of us more than it currently does. This is, I think, the danger of the 21st century. And it's ironic today, I'm fighting with libertarians on Twitter who still make fun of me for making this comparison, where I think they should be far more concerned than they actually are.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are already direct parallels being made. Miles Taylor, the one and only Miles Taylor, was on MSNBC, like drawing a direct parallel between the domestic war on terror. And literally his point was, imagine if we had given ISIS a 4-year head start, as though these two things are comparable at all. I mean, it's absurd, but you can sort of see the neocons lusting for more power and more control, and to trust. I actually think we learned a lot. And some of this is we're adapting to new technologies, and the government didn't have the power to sort of surveil its citizens like it does now 10 years ago, let alone 50 years ago, let alone 100 years ago, let alone when the country was founded. And so we do have obviously some principles that give us the framework to understand, what's right and what's wrong, and what the relationship between the individual and the state should look like. But I think we actually learned a lot over the last, 15 years of sort of experiencing post-Patriot Act America, and just kind of understanding what the enhanced surveillance state would look like. And I think the government has shown that it shouldn't be trusted with such powers. I think these federal agencies in particular that would benefit from an expansion of powers in this domestic war on terror have proven very clearly that they cannot handle this power responsibly, because especially in this climate where terms like white supremacy are sort of expanded to include literally anybody who doesn't agree with the full sort of progressive dogma. And so if our government is listening to Ibram X. Kendi and what constitutes white supremacist extremism, as, by the way, the Biden administration is, this should be terrifying. I mean, this should be utterly terrifying. If we see this sort of expansion of powers under that kind of umbrella categorization, it would be, that's a pretty broad expansion of powers. And I think the key in this particular environment in 2021 is understanding that it would be stemming from these very flawed and vague and overly broad definitions of what constitutes extremism.
By the way, Miles Taylor, now senior fellow at the R Street Institute.
There you go.
Which is ostensibly a right-leaning libertarian think tank, which tells you everything you need to know.
There you go.
Yeah, look, I don't want to pick on specific organizations here, but I do think it's telling in R Street's case that they were kind of like vehement, and not to shift topics too much, they were vehemently out there front and center on like the libertarian leaning side of the net neutrality debate, when Ajit Pai was there a handful of years ago. Now they're, of course, they're opposing anything whatsoever on Section 230, common carrier, all of that stuff. So I don't know. Lots and lots of issues with R Street. Okay, to take it back to the current discussion, though, I frankly don't have a ton to add here. The fusion that Rachel talked about at the end of her comments there is kind of what Angelo Codevilla refers to as the oligarchy, right? In all of his writings, he's very prolific and eloquent on this. And while we're kind of picking up people, I guess I tweeted out an excerpt from an Angelo oligarchy themed essay, I think on Sunday, and Jonah Goldberg was very quick to jump at me and say that it was like an intellectually untenable definition of oligarchy. Like, okay, but like this is kind of like the tension that we're getting at here, right? I feel like every podcast we talk about now, like the definition between kind of like the Ronald Reagan quote, the worst words in government being or the worst words in the English language being I'm from the government and I'm here to help. Contrast with 2019, 2020, like Tucker Carlson-esque rhetoric pertaining to the worst words being I'm from the ruling class and I'm here to subjugate you. That really is the divide. Okay, I mean, when we're like when Rachel says she's battling with libertarians on Twitter, that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about here whether, given everything that's going on here, whether you actually see this multi-institutional kind of private public sector consortium of a ruling class and oligarchy and the Codevilla rhetoric that really does increasingly seem to want to make us something less than sovereign citizens, something less than the we the people language of which the preamble of the Constitution speaks, and something closely approximating subjects and kind of the old like European style model. Go figure. I mean, it's kind of thematically makes sense, right? The people who kind of idolize Western Europe, who love the G7, who love NATO, who kind of love this kind of Eurocentric worldview are the ones who want to make us kind of Euro style subjects to kind of deprive us of our very hard fought and hard won sovereignty of our American citizenry itself. So I don't think that's overstepping the stakes or overstating the stakes, I should say. Codevilla himself had a lengthy essay for Claremont's American Mind website, maybe, I don't know, a year and a half, 2 years ago or so, where I think he said abolish the CIA and the FBI. Look, the extent to which these national security apparatuses end up being, or to the extent to which they are amenable, that they can easily be aggrandized and then wielded against half the citizenry, that ipso facto, if that is happening, that is a very compelling argument against very substantial reform at minimum, possibly leading to Codevilla style outright abolition at maximum. But anyway, speaking of kind of the oligarchy, the ruling class, kind of the private public sector oligarchs, Emily, I'm not sure that there is any bigger oligarch these days than Jeff Bezos. So what's going on there?
Yeah, it's hard to imagine that there is, and he's about to make his journey up into space. There's already a petition to forbid him from re-entering Earth upon his attempt to come back home. But that sort of speaks to his burgeoning status as a villain. Rachel had an excellent piece in the Federalist just this week about how Jeff Bezos is now a Bond villain who's kind of in charge of the Bond villains as Amazon prepares to take over MGM Studios, where Bond is their intellectual property. Now, all that said, there's a new report out in the New York Times again this week about the labor practices at Amazon. And the more this is reported on, the worse Amazon looks. And that's not because I think this is dishonest and garbage journalism. I actually think some of this reporting has been excellent journalism. Notice that it is coming out in the New York Times and not the Washington Post, which Bezos, of course, owns. But it looks like the sort of situation inside some of these warehouses, as we hear more and more. There was the union drive, sort of famously in Bessemer, that failed, but did actually get the support of Senator Marco Rubio and some sort of Republican interest. There's a big sort of issue on Amazon's hands, and it's not just going to be Amazon, but Amazon is bearing the brunt of it because it's a huge company that has these demands of speed and accuracy, and that has sort of created a climate where they treat their workers like widgets. They treat their workers like robots, and this is becoming a sort of increasingly loud complaint from Amazon workers, who Amazon loves to cloak itself. And in your Axios newsletter, 50% of the days you get Amazon talking about how it supports a $15 minimum wage and how successful Amazon's push for a $15 minimum wage has been. Well, of course, Amazon supports that. It will put some of their smaller competitors out of business. And it's easy for them It's easy for them. So they like to brag about their $15 minimum starting wage and about the great benefits that they're able to provide. But at the end of the day, you can't just sort of hang your hat on the good salary and the benefits. You actually have to also treat your workers humanely as they earn that salary and as they earn those benefits. And so they do have insanely high turnover rates. The New York Times story sort of reveals the way that they actually are kind of treated. Workers feel as though they are treated as robots. There has been some previous reporting on it. We heard it a lot with the Bessemer Union drive, but this is a bigger problem because it gets to this issue where these massive companies that do treat people like robots and do have this sort of efficiency mentality in this high-tech era. You could make this argument that it happened in the Industrial Revolution, and yes, those companies had to learn as well. But for Amazon, which is, as we talked about earlier in this episode, increasingly unpopular with both political parties and has less goodwill than it would like, certainly on Capitol Hill, this is going to be a really big issue because it gets to the way that one of our biggest companies is fundamentally run. And I'm curious to know two questions from you guys. One, how do Republicans handle this in the future as these reports from places like the New York Times come out that show the unfortunate working conditions? I mean, the situation is people needing bathroom breaks in some warehouses, and they're different than others. But like some of these basic working conditions at Amazon, how do Republicans handle it in an environment where OSHA does exist and where, there's right to work legislation in all of these red states, but also not a lot of goodwill towards Amazon among Republicans? And then secondly, how does Amazon handle this as a company that has now created this demand for speed and efficiency and has to grapple with transitioning to more humane labor practices?
So I think this is a really interesting debate for the right on a number of fronts. And I think that your questions sort of get to some key nexus areas for Republicans, because this isn't going away. And I think for two reasons. One, especially after COVID, we have wiped out small business in this country. We have, concentrated power at the top. We've made Amazon, maybe in some of these towns, the only, employer of note. When people say, well, you don't have to work at Amazon. Well, in some places you actually do, right? Like in some places there isn't any other option. And, the second issue is that Amazon is poised to actually outpace Walmart as the country's largest retail platform in the next year or two. And so it is now going to become, if it's not already, the nation's largest employer. And I think, this is a question for the right. And I think so much of the discussion right now is around how the right should approach labor policy, because that's what this really is, right? It's a question of labor policy. And it was a little bit tough, I think, for me on the Amazon unionization front. You saw Marco Rubio come out in favor of it. You saw Tommy Tuberville, who was a senator from Alabama, come out against it. And I think the right was really split. And for me, it's almost an argument of circumstance. Do I think the right should always make compelling arguments to labor? Absolutely, right? We should always be making the case that we can represent them and their interests. But I think in this circumstance, if you look at how that union election went, the union itself, it cared marginally about conditions, but it was largely an ideological race. It got behind BLM ideology. It got behind all these sort of ideological entrenchments that weren't the point. And I think that you could argue that that's almost why they lost, because it wasn't exclusively about this labor issue. So I think for the right, I think Orrin Cass is thinking very creatively about this, right? Because where labor is not in our interests, right? When it's aligned against Republicans politically, why would we embrace that? But at the same time, why don't we create another model, right? Of a labor union designed around the things that we care about, right? Whether it's, our value system, families, freedom of religion, all these things that we care about can be the premise for engaging labor, because I think the right has seeded the field, and I think it's to our detriment, because we should care about this. We care about corporate concentration. We care about who's pulling the strings in our economy. We should care about the people creating these jobs and the type of jobs that are available. No longer can we be a party that's like, well, just go get any job is good, even if you get treated like crap. That's, that's just an unsustainable and tenable political position.
Yeah. I agreed all around. Ryan Grodetsky read an op-ed right along these lines for us recently in Newsweek, basically just talking about how awful of a place to work Amazon is, how their rates of warehouse injuries are orders of magnitude higher than others. I'm actually working on an essay right now about Jeff Bezos and Amazon. It'll be at American Affairs Journal later this year. Jeff Bezos's skyrocketing rise to the wealthiest man in the world is pretty harrowing. It seemed to happen actually very, very quickly there. Amazon kind of in the late 2010s, I think it was around 2016 to 2019 or so, like those handful of years, the company just like really took off, honestly. And as someone who's been an Amazon user going back to like the late 90s, I mean, I recall ordering stuff when I was like in elementary school. I guess I didn't realize that it wasn't until like the past 5 years the company like truly attained the status that it has gotten to. But I mean, we can easily just connect this, frankly, back to the antitrust discussion of earlier. I mean, you can kind of go across like industry, sub-industry to sub-industry. I mean, obviously, kind of the retail book industry speaks for itself. We all saw what happened to Amazon's nuking of Ryan Anderson's book on the transgender issue. Amazon has like an 83% market share or something like that in kind of the digital book market. Amazon Web Services, obviously, Amazon basically invented the modern cloud. I mean, that's effectively what Amazon Web Services is. They basically invented it in like 2004, 2005. They now are the server of choice for any number of Fortune 500 companies. They work increasingly with the federal government. That was the entire reason for HQ2 going to Northern Virginia in the first place, back during that ridiculously overhyped sweepstakes for who gets to host Amazon's much ballyhooed HQ2. The whole company, frankly, is pretty toxic, top to bottom, in many respects here. And, we're not going to kind of get to all of kind of the granular labor policy details on this call. But I think Rachel is certainly thinking along along the correct lines here. I mean, there was a statement that a lot of people, I think Oren and American Compass kind of started it, but I think Yuval Levin signed it. Maybe even Jeff Sessions signed it. It came out like last August or September. There's nothing inherently unconservative, frankly, about private sector labor unions. It's the public sector labor unions that are very problematic for any number of reasons, not least of which obviously is just basic kind of, fiscal sanity and guarding the taxpayer. But there's nothing particularly unconservative about private sector labor unions. There is something obviously kind of quote unquote anti-business, but that doesn't mean it's unconservative. And if you go back to look at the writings of Adam Smith wrote about this, literally Smith himself wrote about this. He was not a foe of private sector labor unions. In fact, it made a great deal of sense to him here. So, there is a sweet spot here. There is kind of like an Irving Kristol-esque 2 Cheers for Capitalism sweet spot here. No one is kind of going to join the workers of the world unite rhetoric. No one on this podcast is going to promote that. That is certainly not what we're about at NatCon Squad.
Except Rachel. Rachel definitely is.
I'm the proxy for whatever everyone hates. That's me.
But
regardless of whether I've said it or not.
But look, at a bare minimum, companies like like Amazon, Freudian slip, companies like Amazon and Google, they are chomping at the bit to be broken up here. And especially at a company like Amazon, where the issues are ideological to an extent, it's like the nuking of Ryan Anderson's book, but where the issues are less acutely ideological. They're kind of more disparate. There's lots of other issues about like legitimate old school, like Sherman Antitrust Act restraint of trade concerns about like the book market and stuff. It is screaming for antitrust. So I think let's start there and then kind of fill in labor policy after we get that initial hurdle through.
Well, just briefly, let me say I'm just shocked that one of the corporate titans in this country is following in the same footsteps as the China that most of our corporations like to outsource labor to. This seems to me like a perfect example of further convergence between U.S. and China, and completely in the wrong direction. But I do think also there is I don't know if it's a risk that's being run, but I think a trend. It will be interesting to see how it plays out. And I've long kind of held to this, is to the extent there does continue to be a substantial backlash as labor standards get exposed at places like Amazon, and it's been the left doing it in many cases. The Intercept has been all over Amazon for weeks, particularly in the lead up to that labor vote. I do think you're going to ultimately see a push for increased automation across the board, because these companies are not going to want to deal with the backlash with respect to the way they treat their employees. And it's going to be interesting to see ultimately how that politically plays out, what it means for the economy, what it means, are we really going to have, a massive percentage of jobs essentially destroyed and not come back in some form or fashion? And what are the consequences of that? So I think those are all trends to look for. And I think that coronavirus response will only accelerate that potential trend.
All right. So on that note, I fully agree with everything Ben just said here. Let's kind of segment over to parting shots here. Anyone want to kick us off?
I'll just add one coda to my points regarding the countering domestic terror strategy, which is to say, once again, the size, scope, and nature of the threat has never been clearly laid out. January 6th is cited as a critical, a seminal piece of empirical evidence that's supposed to justify this effort. And we've seen how that's been executed. And we get more and more reporting, largely from Julie Kelly at American Greatness, about the conditions that those being prosecuted and arguably politically persecuted are subjected to. And I think that may well serve, that sprawling investigation may well serve as the archetype for what is to come, I fear, under this countering domestic terror agenda. But it's also worth noting that almost nothing in the document deals with the jihadist threat. So one of the ancillary knock-on effects in the focus on wrong-thinking Americans is that other adversaries, other adversarial forces, real terrorist forces that have done tremendous harm to our homeland are going to be ignored as a consequence of this. So the government takes all of these powers, originally putatively to take on our worst adversaries, and then they turn them back on Americans. And I've heard calls for a second church commission. And I think we might need something even more extreme and substantive than that ultimately to deal with the damage that's been done by these apparatuses that are supposed to keep us safe and instead are being weaponized against Americans.
And all I was going to add to this entire conversation is we're bringing in so much culture and so much economics, and because that's sort of our instinct now, we've come to the recognition, and some of us it wasn't much of a process because we come from backgrounds where it was obvious that culture and economics were inextricably intertwined. But it's amazing. I mean, one thing that I've been thinking about a lot recently is how culture, I've sort of been swimming in the leftist pond for the last few weeks as I've been filling in on Rising. And it's amazing to me the extent to which all of this is really is downstream of our weird and the destruction of so many cultural norms and the sort of weird cultural place that we're in. And the left still likes to talk about that as sort of an abstract thing. And it's sort of a weird way that now blames the right for caring about cancel culture and for talking about cancel culture when they've actually destroyed these norms and made things like now this war on domestic terrorism untenable in any way whatsoever because they have ridiculous definitions that create political strife and enable the government to surveil Americans at an unacceptable rate of power increases. And so it's as we're talking through all of this stuff, at the end of the day, we don't want to get into the chicken or egg, what came first, cultural pain or economic pain, because there's a good argument to be made for both. But it is amazing how much of the economic strife and pain that exists in this country is going to continue to be downstream of the shattered cultural norms post like sexual revolution.
I think this is a really, really important point because as the right kind of goes through this reevaluation that it's doing, we talk a lot about sort of this rethinking of economic policy that's going on in the right. So much of it comes from, to Emily's point, a breakdown of the social consensus, because how we've always understood our market to work, when the right says, well, trust the free market, is the best exchange for all these independent actions. If you actually look at the intellectual justification for that, if you go back and you read Hayek, if you read Oakeshott, if you read Scruton, if you read Tocqueville, all of that depended upon a shared social consensus that kept the market as a barometer of honesty. And when you lose that consensus, the marketplace also breaks down. The two transact upon each other in very, very meaningful ways. And so I've said it before, but as the right, I think, has abandoned its intellectual traditions and intellectual spade work on, our economic policies, like how we constrain economic actors when they get too large on our antitrust policy, how we should think about labor, how we should think about foreign policy. We've ceded all of that ground to this neoliberal consensus that I think it's more and more clear hasn't served us well. And we need a robust intellectual tradition. And I've said it again, or said it before, and I'll say it again, our traditions account for this. And so if you are, I think, like a young conservative, interested in politics on the right, this is the place where intellectual dynamism is happening. There is space for you to be interested and curious and put your ideas into this space. So I would urge any sort of young listener to go down that road because there's a whole ton of space for you to engage here.
Yeah, speaking of kind of rethinking some outmoded or sclerotic economic bromides, Wells King, who works for Orncast American Compass, had a piece, I guess it was a book review technically, at First Things on Friday. The title of the piece is Growing Pains. I'm just going to read the very short first paragraph. Quote, in 2014, Britain's Office for National Statistics revised its GDP methodology to comply with EU standards. It discovered something remarkable. The United Kingdom's economy was nearly 5% larger and growing faster than previously thought. That is, after accounting for prostitution and illegal drugs. So you see what's going on here. They just tweaked, obviously, the GDP data to talk about. So, I mean, nothing, I think, more viscerally embodies this tension between kind of prioritization of GDP at all costs and thinking about what is actually good, what is substantively good, what is getting at Aristotelian human flourishing, what is good for the common good, the good of individuals. That paragraph right there, I think, encapsulates the tension. And there is a tension here. We should not shy away from it. And I think that antitrust, frankly, plays a role in this discussion here. I mean, we could talk about, Amazon, Google, Apple, which, if I'm not mistaken, are the three largest market cap companies in the world right now. Maybe it is better for the United States GDP to let these classic kind of Gilded Age robber baron style monopolists just go and increase like the Gini coefficient, increase the inequality between their astronomical market cap and anyone else. Maybe, I don't know, but what I do know is that it is simply not good for a sovereign people to allow some of these actors, whether they're in the government or, again, in the private sector, in the corporate space, to attain that much power, qua power. And it is not unconservative to recognize, to forthrightly and candidly assert that there are tensions between kind of the fetishization, the maximization of various kind of like abstruse economic data and the actual traditional goals of conservatism, of justice, human flourishing, and the common good. These two things have an uneasy relationship with one another. They oftentimes do point in the same direction. I don't want to kind of undermine that. Like, capitalism obviously is a generally very good thing. But, we should not be afraid to point out when there are tensions there as well.
Russell Kirk, I think, summed this up very well when he said, and I'll paraphrase, what good is it for people to know the price of everything, but the value of nothing? And I think that really gets at what that tension is. Absolutely. No, that's exactly the same tension that Wells is getting at in that First Things piece that I just read as well. But we are way out of time today. So on behalf of Rachel, Emily, and Ben, I am Josh Hammer. We will see you at the next NatCon Squad.